Cops bring black homeless veteran to trial. But when judge hears his name, entire courtroom rises. They called him just another homeless vagrant when they arrested him on fabricated charges. But when Judge Williams heard the name Isaiah Boone spoken in his courtroom, everything changed. Some names carry weight that transcends appearance, and some heroes have been forgotten by everyone except those who matter most. The corner of 5th and Madison had become Isaiah Boone's world, a narrow slice of concrete where he existed in the shadows of a city that had forgotten him. At 52, he moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned to make every calorie count, every movement purposeful. His weathered military jacket, faded beyond recognition of its original color, hung loose on his diminished frame. The morning rush hour flowed around him like water around a stone commuter's, stepping over and around his small collection of possessions without acknowledgement. To them, he was invisible, another casualty of urban decay, another problem to be managed rather than solved. 15 years earlier, Staff Sergeant Isaiah Boone had been one of the military's most decorated special operations soldiers. His unit had operated in the shadows of America's longest wars, conducting missions that would never appear in official records, saving lives that would never be publicly acknowledged. But that was before the mission in Afghanistan that changed everything. Before he'd refused to falsify reports about civilian casualties. Before he'd been branded a troublemaker and systematically destroyed by the very institution he'd served with distinction. The dishonorable discharge had been just the beginning. His records scrubbed, his service erased, his identity systematically dismantled by people who needed his silence more than they valued his integrity. Now sleeping in doorways and surviving on handouts, Isaiah carried the weight of secrets that could topple careers and expose war crimes. But who would believe a homeless black veteran whose own military records had been erased? Who would listen to someone society had already written off as worthless? The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years protecting a country that now pretended he didn't exist, serving leaders who had ultimately betrayed him to protect their own careers. What Isaiah didn't know was that his invisibility was about to end. Sergeant Marcus Griggs of the Metropolitan Police Department had been watching him for weeks, waiting for the right moment to execute a plan that had been years in the making. Griggs wasn't acting alone. The orders came from higher-up people who remembered Isaiah Boone and the secrets he carried, people who had decided that a homeless veteran's word against theirs was still too dangerous to ignore. The plan was simple: arrest him on serious charges, discredit him completely, and ensure that even if he tried to speak out, no one would believe him. Today was the day they would finally silence Isaiah Boone forever. The corner store on 5th Street had been Isaiah's lifeline for months. Mrs. Chen, the elderly owner, had shown him small kindnesses. Day-old sandwiches, a cup of coffee when the weather turned cold, the basic human dignity that had become rare in his world. She never asked questions about his past, never made him feel like a burden. On this particular Tuesday morning, Isaiah sat on the steps outside her store, reading a discarded newspaper and nursing a cup of coffee Mrs. Chen had given him. The headline spoke of military budget increases and veteran support programs, bitter irony for someone who had been erased from the very system those programs were meant to help. He didn't notice the unmarked police car that had been circling the block for the past hour, or the way Sergeant Griggs kept checking his watch as if waiting for a specific time. The setup had been planned meticulously, witnesses in place, evidence ready to be discovered, a narrative already crafted for the media. At exactly 9:47 a.m., Griggs received the text message he'd been waiting for. Go. The first sign of trouble came when 3 patrol cars converged on the corner store, simultaneously their sirens wailing unnecessarily in the quiet morning air. Isaiah looked up from his newspaper, his combat instincts immediately alert to the tactical formation the officers were using. This wasn't a routine response. "Isaiah Boone!" Sergeant Griggs shouted as he approached, his weapon drawn. "You're under arrest." "For what?" Isaiah asked, slowly raising his hands. Years of homelessness had taught him never to make sudden movements around police. But his military training recognized the aggressive posture, the coordinated approach, the deliberate escalation. Armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and resisting arrest. Griggs announced loudly, ensuring the gathering crowd could hear every charge. Isaiah's mind raced. He hadn't left this corner in 2 days, had witnesses who could verify his location, had committed no crime. But as he watched Officer Martinez discover a knife in his belongings, a knife he'd never seen before, and Officer Johnson hold up a wallet that wasn't his, Isaiah understood with crystal clarity that this wasn't about justice. This was about silencing him permanently. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Isaiah felt the familiar weight of betrayal settle on his shoulders. It was the same feeling he'd experienced in Afghanistan when his commanding officers had ordered him to falsify reports, the same sinking realization that the system he'd served was corrupt beyond redemption. "You have the right to remain silent," Griggs recited, but his eyes carried a different message. "You should have stayed silent 15 years ago." The crowd that had gathered included several people who knew Isaiah Mrs. Chen, who was crying and protesting his innocence in broken English. Marcus, a young veteran who Isaiah had helped get into a treatment program. Sarah, a social worker who had tried unsuccessfully to get Isaiah into permanent housing. But their voices were drowned out by the official narrative already being constructed. The planted evidence, the fabricated charges, the coordinated testimony of corrupt officers, it was a masterpiece of institutional manipulation designed to destroy whatever credibility Isaiah might have had. As they loaded him into the patrol car, Isaiah caught sight of his reflection in the window. He looked like exactly what they wanted him to look like: a dangerous criminal, a threat to public safety, someone whose word could never be trusted against that of sworn police officers. The erasure of Isaiah Boone was nearly complete. Nina Clay had been a public defender for 3 years, long enough to recognize the cases that were hopeless and the clients who were beyond help. When she was assigned to represent Isaiah Boone, she expected another routine plea bargain, another homeless defendant who would accept a reduced sentence rather than fight charges he couldn't afford to contest. The case file was damning: armed robbery of a convenience store assault with a deadly weapon resisting arrest. 3 police officers as witnesses, physical evidence, a defendant with no fixed address, and no credible alibi. It should have been straightforward. But something nagged at Nina as she reviewed the paperwork. The timeline didn't quite add up. The witness statements were almost identical, as if they'd been coordinated. And there was something about the defendant's military record, or rather the complete absence of any military record, despite multiple references to his service. Nina had grown up in a military family. Her father had served in Vietnam, her brother in Iraq. She knew that military records didn't just disappear, even for soldiers who'd been dishonorably discharged. The complete absence of any documentation about Isaiah Boone's service was more suspicious than any criminal charge. Isaiah sat in the county jail interview room, his hands folded calmly on the metal table. Despite the orange jumpsuit and the institutional setting, he carried himself with a dignity that Nina found surprising. Most of her clients were either defiant or defeated. Isaiah seemed neither. "Mr. Boone," Nina began, opening her file. "I'm Nina Clay, your court-appointed attorney. I've reviewed your case, and I have to be honest, the evidence against you is substantial." Isaiah nodded slowly. "The evidence they planted, you mean?" "That's a serious accusation," Nina replied. "Do you have any proof that evidence was planted?" "No," Isaiah said quietly. "That's the beauty of their plan. Who's going to believe a homeless black veteran against 3 police officers, especially when that veteran's military records have been conveniently erased?" Nina looked up sharply. "Erased? What do you mean?" For the first time, Isaiah's composure cracked slightly. "I mean that Staff Sergeant Isaiah Boone, who served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 75th Ranger Regiment, who earned a Silver Star and 2 Bronze Stars, who led classified operations that saved American lives, that man doesn't exist anymore. According to official records, he never existed." That night, Nina stayed late in her office, diving deeper into Isaiah's case than she'd ever investigated a public defender assignment. What she found, or rather what she didn't find, was disturbing. There was no record of Isaiah Boone's military service in any database she could access. No discharge papers, no service records, no medical files. For someone who claimed to have served for over a decade, he had left no paper trail whatsoever. But Nina's brother worked at the VA, and he owed her a favor. A few phone calls later, she had access to information that painted a very different picture. There were medical records for treatments Isaiah had received for PTSD and combat injuries. There were references to classified operations and commendations that had been sealed or redacted. Most importantly, there was a newspaper clipping from 2008, a small item about a military investigation into civilian casualties in Afghanistan. The article mentioned that several soldiers had come forward with allegations of cover-ups and war crimes. One of those soldiers was identified only as Staff Sergeant I.B. Nina stared at the clipping pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. Isaiah Boone hadn't just been erased, he'd been deliberately targeted for erasure. Elijah Cross had been investigating police corruption for the Metro Herald for 5 years, and he'd developed a nose for cases that were more than they appeared. The arrest of Isaiah Boone had caught his attention not because of what was reported, but because of what wasn't. 3 police officers, all with histories of excessive force complaints, just happened to witness an armed robbery by a homeless veteran who had no prior criminal record. The convenience store owner insisted the defendant was innocent, but her testimony was being dismissed as unreliable. The defendant's military records were completely sealed for national security reasons. Elijah had seen enough corruption cases to recognize the patterns. But when he tried to dig deeper into Isaiah's background, he hit walls that suggested federal involvement. Military records that were not just sealed but actively scrubbed. References to classified operations that had been redacted from official reports. Most intriguingly, when Elijah ran Isaiah's name through his network of military contacts, he got responses that ranged from "never heard of him" to "you need to stop asking questions about that name." Someone very powerful wanted Isaiah Boone to disappear, and they were willing to use the criminal justice system to make it happen. Aaliyah Boone hadn't spoken to her father in 8 years, not since his discharge from the military had sent him into a spiral of anger and self-destruction that had torn their family apart. She'd been a senior in high school when everything fell apart, watching her hero father transform into a bitter stranger who couldn't explain why his career had ended or why their family had to move 3 times in 6 months. Now 26 and working as a social worker in Chicago, Aaliyah learned about her father's arrest through a Google alert she'd set up years earlier, a digital thread connecting her to a man she tried to forget but never could. The news articles painted him as a dangerous criminal, but Aaliyah knew better. Whatever her father had become, whatever demons he'd battled, he wasn't violent. He'd never raised a hand to her or her mother, even in his darkest moments. The charges against him were fabricated, she was certain of it, against her better judgment, against the advice of friends who reminded her of the pain he'd caused. Aaliyah booked a flight to Washington. She told herself she was coming to see justice done, but the truth was simpler and more complicated. Despite everything, he was still her father. When she walked into Nina Clay's office, the young public defender saw immediately where Isaiah had gotten his quiet strength. Aaliyah carried herself with the same dignity, the same refusal to be broken by circumstances beyond her control. "I want to help," Aaliyah said simply. "Tell me what you need." Working together, Nina, Elijah, and Aaliyah began to uncover the full scope of the conspiracy against Isaiah. The trail led back to 2008 in a classified operation in Afghanistan, where Isaiah's unit had been ordered to cover up civilian casualties caused by a drone strike that had targeted the wrong building. Isaiah had refused to falsify his report, insisting that the families of the dead civilians deserved acknowledgement and compensation. His commanding officer, Colonel Richard Harrington, had initially supported him, but pressure from higher up the chain of command had been intense. The operation had been politically sensitive, involving allies who couldn't be embarrassed and contractors who couldn't be held liable. When Isaiah continued to push for accountability, he'd been systematically destroyed. His records were classified and then erased. His discharge was changed from honorable to dishonorable through administrative manipulation. His security clearance was revoked, making him unemployable in his field. His family was harassed until they moved multiple times, eventually leading to his wife leaving him and taking Aaliyah. But the people responsible for the cover-up had never felt completely safe. Isaiah knew too much, had seen too much, and even as a homeless veteran, he represented a potential threat to careers and reputations that had been built on lies. Sergeant Griggs, it turned out, was the son-in-law of General Morrison, who had been a colonel in 2008 and had orchestrated much of the cover-up. The arrest was meant to be the final step in a 15-year campaign to silence Isaiah permanently. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling: phone records showing calls between Griggs and Morrison in the days before the arrest, financial records showing payments to the officers involved, and most damning of all, body camera footage that had been accidentally left running during the evidence planting. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Officer James Bell, the youngest member of Griggs's team, had been having second thoughts about the operation from the beginning. A rookie with only 2 years on the force, Bell had joined the police to serve his community, not to participate in frame-ups and cover-ups. When Bell learned that Isaiah was a veteran, a decorated soldier whose service had been erased, his conscience finally overcame his fear. He reached out to Nina through an intermediary offering to testify about what he'd witnessed. The meeting took place in a parking garage at midnight, like something out of a spy movie. Bell was nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder, but his testimony was devastating. He had recordings of Griggs planning the operation, photographs of the planted evidence before it was discovered, and most importantly, his own body camera footage that showed the entire setup. "They told me he was a terrorist sympathizer," Bell said, his voice shaking. "They said he'd betrayed his country and needed to be stopped. But when I saw him sitting there reading his newspaper feeding pigeons, he's just a broken old man who served his country and got destroyed for telling the truth." The next morning, Bell was found beaten unconscious in his apartment, but he'd already given Nina everything she needed. The courtroom of Judge Patricia Williams was known for its no-nonsense atmosphere and the judge's reputation for fairness. Nina had requested Judge Williams, specifically knowing that she was one of the few judges in the district who couldn't be intimidated by political pressure or influenced by prosecutorial theatrics. As the trial date approached, the prosecution's case began to show cracks. The planted evidence was exposed through Bell's testimony and body camera footage. The coordinated witness statements fell apart under scrutiny. Most damaging of all, Elijah Cross's investigative reporting had brought national attention to the case, making it impossible for the conspiracy to continue operating in shadows. But Nina knew that proving Isaiah's innocence was only half the battle. She needed to restore his identity to show the court and the world who he really was, beneath the homeless veteran facade that had been used to discredit him. The key would be getting his military records unsealed and finding witnesses who could testify to his true service record. It was a long shot. Most of his operations had been classified, his fellow soldiers scattered or sworn to secrecy. But Aaliyah had been working her own contacts, reaching out to veterans organizations and military advocacy groups. The courtroom was packed on the first day of trial with reporters, veterans advocates, and curious citizens filling every available seat. Isaiah sat at the defense table in a borrowed suit, his bearings straight despite the months of incarceration. For the first time in years, he looked like the soldier he had once been. Prosecutor David Martinez opened with a straightforward presentation of the state's case. Armed robbery, assault, resisting arrest. The evidence seemed overwhelming: witness testimony, physical evidence, the defendant's inability to account for his whereabouts. But Nina's cross-examination began to expose the holes in the prosecution's story. The timeline didn't match. The evidence had been handled improperly. The witnesses had coordinated their stories. Most importantly, Nina introduced the body camera footage that showed Griggs planting the knife in Isaiah's belongings. The courtroom gasped as they watched the deliberate frame-up unfold on screen. "Your Honor," Nina said, rising from her chair, "the defense calls General Richard Harrington, United States Army, retired." The courtroom stirred as a distinguished man in his 60s walked to the witness stand. General Harrington had been Isaiah's commanding officer in Afghanistan, and Nina had spent weeks convincing him to testify. "General Harrington," Nina began, "do you recognize the defendant?" "I do," Harrington replied, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "That is Staff Sergeant Isaiah Boone, one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege to command." The prosecutor objected, claiming the testimony was irrelevant, but Judge Williams overruled him. "I want to hear this," she said. Harrington's testimony was devastating to the prosecution's case. He described Isaiah's heroism, his integrity, his refusal to participate in cover-ups even when it cost him his career. He explained how Isaiah had been systematically destroyed for telling the truth about civilian casualties. When General Harrington finished his testimony, Judge Williams sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Then she did something unprecedented in her 20 years on the bench. She stood up. "Staff Sergeant Boone," she said, her voice carrying a new tone of respect, "would you please stand?" Isaiah rose slowly, confusion evident on his face. He had no idea what was happening, but years of military training had taught him to follow orders from superior officers. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," Judge Williams announced, "We are in the presence of a true American hero." Staff Sergeant Isaiah Boone was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action, 2 Bronze Stars for heroic service, and the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. He served his country with distinction for over a decade, and he was destroyed by the very system he served because he refused to compromise his integrity. The judge's words hung in the air, like a benediction transforming the atmosphere in the courtroom completely. What happened next was spontaneous and unprecedented. General Harrington, still on the witness stand, came to attention and saluted Isaiah. Then one by one, every veteran in the courtroom stood up. It started with an elderly man in the back row, a Vietnam veteran who recognized the look of someone who had been abandoned by his country. Then a middle-aged woman who had served in Iraq stood up, followed by a young man who still bore the scars of Afghanistan. Soon half the courtroom was standing in silent tribute to a man they had never met but whose story they understood in their bones. These were people who knew what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, to come home to a country that didn't always appreciate what they had given. Nina felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her client. This broken, homeless man who had been written off by society finally received the recognition he deserved. Aaliyah was crying openly, seeing her father not as the bitter stranger who had driven her away, but as the hero she had always known him to be. Even some of the court officers, veterans themselves, stood at attention. The bailiff, a former Marine, wiped tears from his eyes as he maintained his position. Prosecutor Martinez, faced with the complete collapse of his case and the overwhelming evidence of a conspiracy, made a decision that surprised everyone. He stood up and addressed the court directly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "in light of the evidence presented, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Staff Sergeant Boone. Furthermore, the state will be filing charges against the officers involved in this conspiracy." The courtroom erupted in applause, but Judge Williams gavelled for order. She wasn't finished yet. "Staff Sergeant Boone," she said, "this court owes you an apology. Your country owes you an apology. You were failed by the very institutions you served, and justice demands that we acknowledge that failure." She paused, looking directly at Isaiah. "All charges are dismissed. You are free to go with the thanks of a grateful nation that should have never forgotten your service." The dismissal of charges against Isaiah was only the beginning. Within days of the trial's conclusion, federal investigators arrested Sergeant Griggs General Morrison and 3 other officers involved in the conspiracy. The FBI launched a comprehensive investigation into the systematic targeting of veterans who had knowledge of classified operations. Officer James Bell, despite his injuries from the beating he'd received, was placed in protective custody and became the key witness in the federal case. His courage in coming forward had not only saved Isaiah, but exposed a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of military and law enforcement. Isaiah was released from jail to a hero's welcome, with veterans organizations providing him with temporary housing and support services. For the first time in 15 years, he had hope that his life could be rebuilt. The media attention brought national focus to the plight of homeless veterans and the ways that whistleblowers were systematically silenced and destroyed by the institutions they had served. The Isaiah Boone case became a catalyst for legislative reform. Congress passed the Veterans Protection Act, which created new safeguards for military whistleblowers and established an independent ombudsman to investigate claims of retaliation against service members who reported misconduct. The Department of Defense was forced to review thousands of cases where soldiers had been discharged under questionable circumstances, leading to the restoration of benefits and honors for dozens of veterans who had been wrongfully punished for reporting war crimes or corruption. Nina Clay left the Public Defender's Office to establish the Boone Foundation, a legal advocacy organization dedicated to representing veterans who had been failed by the system. Elijah Cross won a Pulitzer Prize for his investigative reporting on the case. Most importantly, the case sparked a national conversation about how America treats its veterans, particularly those who have the courage to speak truth to power, even when it costs them everything. 6 months after the trial, Isaiah and Aaliyah sat together on a park bench, feeding pigeons and talking about the future. The years of separation and pain couldn't be erased overnight, but they were building something new, a relationship based on understanding and forgiveness rather than the hero worship of her childhood. Isaiah had his military records restored and his discharge changed back to honorable. But more importantly, he had his daughter back and a sense of purpose. He spent his days working with other homeless veterans, helping them navigate the system that had failed him for so long. The broken man who had been arrested on fabricated charges had become whole again, not through the restoration of his honors, but through the restoration of his family and his sense of worth.